Poems to a Listener, readings and conversation with contemporary poets.
Σ' αυτά τα κλαδιά μείνανε χνούδια από την πρώτη νιώτη μου. Τις κουμαριές ξύπνησα για να βρω το μανιτάρι. Σπασμένα στα μια γύρω από τη στέρνα. Στα συντρίμια τους έγραφα τους στίχους μου. Σε μια κουφάλα μυστική τα φύλαγα. Πάω τώρα, 20 χρόνια περασμένα, μήπως και τα βρω. On these branches I left my youth. At the crack of dawn I prowl round the shrubs for mushrooms. On bits of broken water jugs I wrote my verses, hiding them inside the hollow of trees. I've come back to look for them 20 years later.
Welcome to Poems to a Listener. I'm Henry Lyman, and in this half-hour program we'll be visiting with poet Eleni Fourtouni, translator of poems and journals by Greek women in resistance. Women who resisted the German occupation of Greece in World War II, who supported the liberal side in the civil war which followed, and were later exiled by the right-wing Greek government in concentration camps located on various deserted islands. The poem we just heard by Victoria Theodorou describes her return to the island prison camp called Trikari.
Some of her fellow exiles and her decided to go back 20 years after they had been released as a pilgrimage. And as Victoria Theodorou says in her prologue of her poetry, she was returning to remember her life and the other women there and to find traces of their life and their captivity, and especially to write.
To remember, to write.
Remember and to write. And this poem we just read comes from that. I like to read another poem. I just imagine her here when she went back with her lover or her husband or her friend, and she brings him up to this wall, and this is what she tells him. Against this wall where they stood me up barefoot to take my measurements, warm me now, uplift me. And here where I was pushed down, give me your hand. I'm light now, and I wear a shirt as bright red as an aloe. Come over here, where they made me roll the triple thick barbed wire. Wrap me in the velvet of your arms. And over here, where I lack the cauldrons and the ammunition cases. Here is the olive tree, where I was getting the 50 grams of bitter, tasting, dry nourishment. Where I stood up, only to be shoved down. I placed on the linen cloth the bread I made between two poems. Here is roast meat and nuts, and here is wine. Let's eat today, let's drink for the hunger of those years.
How did you get involved with Victoria Theodorou and the other poems and poets you've translated, as well as the journals?
In 1974, there was the junta. There was a military dictatorship in Greece. Everybody was very oppressed. I wanted to do something to help in the struggle that was going on in spite of the harsh measures. I decided that I was going to translate Greek poets whose work was suppressed because of political oppression. And I went around trying to find such work, and I began to translate it. And from that, after I came to the journals, because two of the poets I translated dealt with the Second World War and the participation of the women in the resistance movement.
The Germans occupied Greece in 1941. What particular memories do you have of that period? The occupation, the resistance?
Within weeks after the Germans came, days I think, I saw my cousins who were 20 years old to 25 years old, immediately dressing in khakis. I don't know where they found uniforms, and saw them with guns. There were all guns in the village that my grandfathers had, and there were hunting guns, and I saw the young men banding together and many young women and going off to the mountains.
Do you have any poems of your own which recall that time?
I have one poem, and this is part of it. Once again, the old image comes into focus. The proud blond soldier, his shining black boots, his spotless green uniform. Smiling, he lugs a sack into the schoolyard. The children curious gather. He dips his ruddy hand inside the sack. The children hold their breath. What is it? What? He must have been in our gardens again, looting the cabbage, the children think. Their brown hands fly to their eyes. No, we mustn't look at it. It's too horrible. But we are full of curiosity. Between our spread fingers, we see. The soldier's laughter is gleefully loud as he pulls out the heads of 2 Greek partisans.
Did you actually see that then?
I did. You see, Germans were not stationed permanently in our village, but they used to come occasionally to loot and to burn, intimidate the people, to make arrests, especially when there was guerrilla resistance acts nearby.
What role did women play, particularly, in the resistance movement?
The women participated in full combat and had the same type of roles as the men did. But there was a big fight to be won before they managed to do that. They had to overcome one authority, and that was their parental authority. You see, Greek women were closed in the home, and their roles were very much determined. The resistance gave the women in Greece an opportunity to step out. This is a passage from an oral history by the Amando Grisona, a woman who was involved in the resistance. For the first time, girls our age felt important, capable, indispensable. For the first time, we were stepping outside the home and taking on roles other than those assigned to us by our fathers and strictly enforced by our mothers. But you are girls, they cried. Our reputations would be ruined. No one would want to marry us. We would disgrace the name of our fathers. There was no end to the calamities we would bring upon our families. But we had decided to do this, and we persisted until our parents came to believe in us, respecting us for our determination, and realizing that our actions might spare all of us the even greater disgrace of submitting to the enemy.
What effect did the resistance movement have, do you think, on these young women who participated in it, who were partisans?
Oh, well, of course, it gave them a sense of themselves, a sense of importance, of their own value and their own abilities, what they can do outside the home, that they can take decisions, that they can fight, that they can accomplish anything they set out to accomplish.
They really realized themselves as individuals and as people?
Yes, yes. They gained the respect of the men as their equals, because they needed them as equals, and they needed them as strong and inventive and enduring. Here's a passage describing a demonstration which took place in Athens against the Germans. And this was written by Dimitra Labrakis. A young girl lay dying beside a tank. Her name was Panayota Stathopoulou. She had been my schoolmate and a member of our group. Another young woman lay bleeding a few meters away. It was Kula Lili. She had jumped up on the tank when she saw the machine gunner firing at Panayota, and he had shot her with his pistol. Now he pointed the machine gun at us. We put down our stretchers, joined hands, and stood in front of the tank, guarding the wounded with our bodies. We stared at the soldier until he slowly turned the mouth of the machine gun away from us.
What happened to these young women?
Well, many of these young women, of course, were arrested by the Germans or by the Greek collaborationist government. They were imprisoned. Some of them were executed. And
there were many executions.
Many women and many men, yes. This is a poem by Rita Bumi Papas, and it's written as though with the voice of the young woman executed. Κρινιώ. Aim straight at my heart. It has served me well up to now. To make it easy for you, I've sewn this black piece of cloth right in the middle of my breasts. I don't know what your fire will be like. Poor beardless soldiers. They've got you up at dawn on my account. I've never held a gun. I don't know. I see your eyes wide open. You can't help all this. Your hands want to touch me before they pull the trigger. I understand. You probably still have the nicknames of your boyhood. And who knows, we might have played together in the streets. Go on. Spare me the morning frost. I'm almost naked. Dress me in your fire. Smile at me, boys. Cover my body with your gaze. I've never been covered by a lover, not even in dream.
Despite the mass executions, the resistance movement was successful, right? The Germans were
yes.
forced to retreat in 1944.
Yes.
And what happened then?
A civil war broke out, which was more devastating for Greece than the German occupation. And the civil war lasted until 1950. After the Germans left, the British, of course, who were the great power at the time, wanted the same political situation in Greece as it was before the war. There is monarchy and the traditional, very conservative, right-wing politicians in order for the British to have access to the Middle Eastern territories through Greece. And they realized that they probably would not be able to do that if the political situation in Greece changed. And in order to bring back the status quo, they had to neutralize this huge, well-armed army of national liberation.
Which had defeated the Germans in
Which
Greece.
defeated the Germans. Yeah. Well, they were tricked into disarming. And when the government and the British did not keep their promises to them as how the new government will be formed, then there was a lot of protest. In addition to that, right-wing gangs sprang up throughout the countryside, which began to terrorize the resistance people. So the people, the members of the resistance, were forced to take arms again and go back to the mountains in order to save themselves. I like to read a passage from a journal by Eleni Fourtouni. Midnight, August 21, 1946. In the Riana Arcadia, Katsarea's gang surrounded the house of the priest, broke down the door, and asked for his daughter, Kassiani, for interrogation. "Tell your chief to come interrogate me tomorrow," she told them. "I won't go away." Her arrogance drove the gang wild. They dragged her out of her house and took her into the ravine. Her mother and sister, who had tried to follow, were tied together onto an olive tree. In the ravine, the gang cut off Kassiani's hair, tore away her clothing, and with the butts of their guns beat her on the breast, the head, and the belly. She was nearly dead when her sister found her. Shortly before she died, she said, "I was only beaten, not dishonored."
Only beaten.
Yeah.
Why were women treated, in particular, with such cruelty?
The tormentors were men, and they could not stand to see women say no to them.
They couldn't take it.
No, they could not take women resisting. "Who are you?" they would say. "You're just a weak woman. Who are you to say no?" Old Song. This is another poem by Victoria Theodoro. They threw her body on the stretcher, arms dragging on the gravel, the tassel of her braid, a golden broom, sweeping the road to the river. Around her the mocking mob pokes at her belly. They made our mothers come out to see her shame, to see what's in store for us, their rebel daughters, celebrating her death in our mountains. But the women cried and sung for her. They washed the slime from her face. Tenderly they closed her visionary's eyes. They told her story to the reeds. A passing poet will sing her song. I'm only a sparrow beside the river reeds. I don't sing. I don't cry. I don't forget. I have marked the site with my nest. I don't live for the winter.
She's singing her memory.
Yes.
It's a memorial.
And she gives a promise that I'm trying to fulfill by making this story known, this era.
How was the Civil War resolved?
It was not really resolved. It hasn't been resolved until today. Finally, the left lost, and the Democratic Army, as it was called, was totally crushed. Those who were not killed were imprisoned, executed, exiled, and for the last 30 years, until 1974, they were persecuted and oppressed.
Many of these former resistance members who were persecuted and exiled were sent then to concentration camps?
Yes, concentration camps which were established in different islands, and there people were sent by hundreds of thousands to remain for as long as they persisted in their beliefs. In other words, the government gave them a choice to sign a so-called Declaration of Repentance in which they repudiated their struggle and they promised to be law-abiding citizens. And Trickery was one of these islands.
And that's where Victoria Theodorou...
That's where Victoria Theodorou spent 5 years of her life. This is a poem again by Victoria Theodorou, and it describes her arrival to the island. When the whales spat me out on this beach, I was too dazed to understand their warning carved on the cliffs, too sick to be afraid. Hope for nothing, it read. Later, when I took in its meaning, I scorned it. Hope, what use is it to me, I thought. The sea will stand by me and the olive tree. I'm not the first to taste exile, but I will be the last. I will abolish it with my life. I swear.
How did she abolish it?
They were put there in order to be broken, humiliated, and signed this Declaration of Repentance.
But something very different happened?
Yes, something very different happened. This is a passage from Victoria Theodorou's journal describing the camp at Trickery. The camp was located on top of a hill surrounded by rows of barbed wire. For weeks we slept on the ground without fire or blankets until finally we were divided into 3 groups and placed within separate barbed wire enclosures. We had already tasted many forms of torture and we had grown immune to fear. The more they tried to fence us in, the more we struggled to break through, crawling under the barbed wire to visit one another and care for those who were ill. Eventually, we broke down the fences and enlarged the camp area. We began to repair the small tents we found there, and using our hands and fingernails as tools, built low earth walls over which we tied the canvas. The first summer storms brought our hard work down on us in heaps of stones and mud. But we were young. The sun came out again, and we kept building until finally our little hut stood impregnable against the weather.
That shows tremendous initiative.
Yes.
And strength.
At first they waited for the camp command to do things for them, sanitation, etc. But when they saw that they were not about to do it, they decided they have to do it by themselves. We stuffed mattresses and pillows with dry leaves and wove mats, baskets, and hats to protect us from the sun. We carved spoons and dishes out of olive wood and made wall hangings from driftwood and shells. We decorated our tents with them and gave them to each other as presents at Christmas and Easter or on any other occasions we could think of as an excuse to celebrate. You see, celebration was very important there, and celebration by singing and dancing and inventing holidays and occasions to give presents and care for each other was one way to keep their spirits up. When the practical aspects of our life were more or less under control, we began organizing a system of education. Many women in the camp were entirely illiterate, and some could write only their names. It was wonderful to see the enthusiasm with which these women began to learn the alphabet as they patiently traced the letters in the sand. Eventually, we obtained some writing materials and a few books, and middle-aged women who had never held a pencil actually learned to read and write.
But this wasn't permitted for very long.
It was never really permitted. They did it against the authorities. Our efforts were observed by the authorities, however, and soldiers would occasionally come to search our tents. Once they found a notebook with personal journal entries and poems. This resulted in burning of our books, writing materials, and manuscripts. But one of us found the opportunity to dig a hole in a nearby grove and there bury a tin box containing some of our poems and journals. Their discovery could mean harsh sentences, even death.
The authorities had some other purpose in mind for them than just to imprison them, to sign the...
To make everybody sign the Declaration of Repentance. And those who persisted in saying no were kept in the concentration camps.
Because they refused.
Because they refused, yes. And finally, 1,000 of these unrepentant women were shipped to Macronissos, where their life was very, very harsh.
To be forced to sign.
To be forced to sign. This is a passage from a journal, the Macronissos Journal, written by Aphroditi Mavroidi Pandelescu, describing that place. At the office, we were put under tremendous pressure to sign. We were pinned against the wall, insulted and beaten with whips and brass knuckles until we collapsed in our own blood and vomit. The officers then would try to hold the pen between our numbed fingers, forcing our hands to trace our names on the prepared statement of repentance. Those of us who were still able would fling the pen at the officer's face. Only those who had lost consciousness would let their hands be led. Each time a paralyzed hand would trace a signature, the officers would congratulate each other, proud of having helped another misguided woman to see the light and attain salvation.
What was the statement of repentance? How was it phrased?
Oh, it was as follows. Entirely on my own and without any influence by force, I renounce with all my soul and with disgust the foreign instigated and directed rebellion and everything it represents, and I pledge to be, henceforth, a law-abiding citizen. These statements were published in the local newspapers, and they were circulated everywhere in Greece after they were signed.
What became of those who did sign, who were forced to sign?
I asked this very question to Victoria Theodorou and Aphroditi Mavroidi Pandelescu, and they said, had we signed, our signature would not have been just a simple signature of our name on a piece of paper. It was the beginning of 1,000 compromises that we would have to make. They would never be left alone. They would always have been called to collaborate.
But they were ultimately released, or?
Yes, 1952 and 1953, the people kept demanding the closing down of the camps. And the government, of course, did not know what to do with these people who still refused to sign. And they found one way to release them. They gave them furloughs. Victoria Theodorou was released on furlough like that.
What was the political situation during this time?
It was very unstable until 1954. And then the right wing really became very entrenched and very strong for many, many years. In 1964, there was a brief attempt to establish democracy in Greece by the Center Party, which lasted for 2 years. And a few months later, the colonels took over.
And a coup.
The
right?
coup, yeah, there was a coup. The colonels took over. It was a military dictatorship in Greece until 1974.
How did the people respond?
With resistance. And poetry came out of this resistance as well. This is a poem by Jenny Mastoraki, a young woman very much involved in the resistance against the colonels, who was beaten and imprisoned in 1973. The silence I've nurtured inside 4 walls was meant to become a song deep and dark, like speechless water, like the pocket in my mother's apron, to give each her own, to spread like the message of the cranes, in the streets, in the squares, in the public urinals, in waiting rooms, song like the Mass on Palm Sunday, song of bread and water, song of the people, my song.
Did that song prevail?
Yes, for the first time in 40 years, Greece is a free country. There's no political prisoners, there is no oppression. All authors, all publishers can function, all political parties. And as a result of the participation of the women in the resistance, there is the women's movement now in Greece that has sprung from that.
So that it can really be traced back to those women who were in
Oh,
Trikari.
yes, not only to the women themselves, but to the new awareness and consciousness of women and what they can do. And all the books now that are written by the women in the resistance, the personal accounts, the journals, the oral histories, are wonderful examples of what women can do. They are read by young women. It's since 1974 that such publications have been allowed to surface.
To return to the women who were actually imprisoned in the concentration camp at Trikari, what do they think of the situation today, particularly with regard to women?
They are very hopeful that this attempt to have democracy in Greece will be a lasting one. And they see, of course, that the position of women is improving. They feel that women today, the young women today, have a sense of independence and a sense of themselves that they didn't have until they went into the resistance movement.
And the sense that they developed so strongly on the island.
Yes. A final poem by Victoria Theodorou, set in the island of Trikari, which I think is a distillation of their life there. Women by the thousands were walled in this empty, nameless island, officially declared unfit for human habitation, infested with yellow fever and typhus. We were the first to camp here. On this meager soil we worked, we gave birth, we buried, we sang, we abolished emptiness, we built kilns and workshops, wells and windmills. Here we lived out the clay age. We dug for roots, we coaxed the music from the reed, we made a lyre from the turtle shell.
She remembers how they made the lyre, the ancient Greek stringed instrument, out of a turtle shell.
Yes.
What does that say to you?
The fact that they triumphed, the fact that they made life out of a death-like situation. They made life, they made song, they created themselves, their freedom, and their self-dignity.
Could you say some of that poem in the original Greek?
Yes. Στεριά κατοίκητη, έρμη, ανώνυμη, στο φτενό χώμα έσκαψα, γέννησα, έθαψα, τραγούδισα, κατάργησα την ερημιά. Τη μουσική την έβγαλα από το καλάμι και έκαμα λύρα με χελώνα σκάφκαλο.
We've been visiting with poet Eleni Fourtouni and listening to selections from Greek Women in Resistance and Greek Women Poets, both published by Felfini Press, New Haven, Connecticut. I'm Henry Lyman. Thanks for joining us.
Poems to a Listener was produced by Henry Lyman in cooperation with WFCR Amherst, Massachusetts. Financial assistance was provided by the Massachusetts Council on the Arts and Humanities, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Massachusetts Foundation for Humanities and Public Policy.